I was concerned about the progress of UKIP years ago, and although I thought that Europe was badly in need of reform and that pressure from an organisation like UKIP, a party like UKIP, might help to drive that reform, I was also very concerned that UKIP was also a holding cell for racism. And indeed, that is precisely what I identified. I pulled out of UKIP as much as I possibly could, and I made my thoughts on the matter as public as I possibly could. And Mr. Farage has actually continued the story. He's continued it with his binoculars down in Dover. And it's a story where Brexit was really won by an emphasis on racism, by an emphasis on immigration, which was not really out of control at all, was no greater in 2016 than it had been 10 years earlier. And the modern Conservative Party, under someone like 30p Lee, is now reconfigured to be UKIP light, or indeed UKIP itself, and it's defined by 30p Lee, by Suella Braverman, who dreams of Rwanda, and says today, for example, that if you're not happy to see migrants being treated poorly, then you are unpatriotic. This is the modern Conservative Party. It's not a party that I recognise. And I think, well, two things. Number one, I think the policies about immigration, and particularly about small boats. Remember, it's small boats. This is an attempt to dehumanise the people who are in the small boats, to dehumanise the refugees. If they could just refer to them as numbers, I'm sure that would be significantly more attractive. So I think there are two problems, or two issues. Number one, I think that the policies are morally wrong. I think they're against the United Nations Refugee Convention that we signed in 1951, something that Churchill helped to launch. I think it's also, number two, an unrealistic plan. I don't think it can work. This is something that the Eye suggested today, that it simply isn't realistic. The idea that we can pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights, this puts us on a par with Belarus and Russia at this particular moment. Are these the two bedfellows we really want? It allows us to reject the European Convention on Human Rights. That's something, that is something that was one of the bedrocks of the legislation that came into effect after the Second World War, something that Churchill helped to pioneer. I think the idea that the Prime Minister and Suella Braverman are putting about, that the small boats is something people are most concerned about, it's simply not true. If you repeat an idea, maybe people start to believe it, but those are people who haven't thought about the issue. I think people are more concerned about the cost of living, about the state of the NHS, about the environment, about education. Maybe they might be concerned about migration in general, but they're not concerned about small boats. They might be concerned about foreigners being shored up in hotels. But that's a Home Office decision. That's not the small boats. That's the Home Office goes slow. And if you look at the figures, although there are a sizable number of Albanian men who've come over in small boats, there's also a sizable number of Afghan refugees who've come over in small boats. It's not possible to say they're all illegal migrants. The Afghans seem to me to be legal migrants, abandoned by Dominic Raab, who was sunning himself on Crete, slapping on more factor 10, and refusing to get back to doing his job when Kabul fell. The fact that Afghans are still making this perilous journey means we didn't put in place a safe and viable route. Only 22 Afghans have apparently been given refugee status through that safe scheme. That's absurd. After 2 years, it's absurd. It's laughable. It's wrong. We should not be pushing the human rights law to the limits. We should not be challenging EU judges on their laws, on our laws, on laws and legal positions that we share and we help to draft. The idea that there'll be no entry for these people from today, that we can backdate legislation. This is not British. The calls to back the law to stop boats and back Britain, these two things don't necessarily go together. I back Britain. I certainly don't back laws to stop the boats. I would back laws to make the boats redundant. I think the boats should not be happening. In order to stop the boats, we should provide centres in France so that people can go there, register their interest in coming to the UK, be processed, if necessary, be put on a ferry. It amounts to the same issue. And if they're fraudulent, be deported. But that means the Home Office actually has to do some work. So what is the real plan? Because if this doesn't work, and if this is morally wrong, it's going to get rejected. So what is the real plan? The real plan goes along with rejecting the Dobbs Amendment. It goes along with failing to implement an alternative for the Dublin III regulation. It goes along with the racist rhetoric which underpins a lot of the Brexit manoeuvring in 2016. It goes along with the darker side of UKIP. Is any of that going to work? No. So the only thing that one can imagine that this is going to do is to keep the problem alive, to dangle like some sort of striptease artist a possible solution until the next election. It's a holding pattern, in other words, like a plane circling over a very dodgy or crazy airport. It's a distraction from the real problems that we face at the moment. In the same way as immigration was a distraction from all the serious subjects that needed to be discussed in advance of Brexit. And will this be enough to keep our interest and to save the Conservative Party? Well, it might save something, but it's not the Conservative Party. It's not, as I say, the party of Thatcher. It's not the party of Disraeli. It's not any sort of party that I would recognise as being in line with the Conservative principles that were laid out in the past. This is a savage policy, and it deserves to fail. I think it will fail, and I think in the end it will take the party with it. Suella Braverman, if Rishi Sunak wishes to pin his fortunes onto the mast of Suella Braverman's folly, he will destroy the Conservative Party. And he might well seriously damage the UK at the same time. I don't know which is worse.